Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Myth Destroyers. Tonight, we will be smashing some common myths that people may have about diversity in the classroom.
First, we're going to talk about one of the major points that really stuck out to us in TAC 330. What is diversity? And is diversity just having different ethnicities in your classroom? Many people think of diversity as just having different races, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds, but does it go deeper than that? Is there more to it than just our genetics and our beliefs?
All three of us have come from different schools and had different experiences growing up. Tonight we're going to dive into them and see how different schools have different diversities. Hi guys, this is Danny Plank. I'm from Gardner, Kansas. The population of Gardner is about 21,000. My high school is combined with a smaller town of about 400 people down the road. My high school's population was about 1,400 kids. The majority of my school was made up of white kids and 16% other ethnicities, of mostly Hispanic.
Hello, my name is Emily Bloom, and I grew up in the itty-bitty town of Clay Center, Nebraska. My school is consolidated of 4 other itty-bitty tiny towns, all with under 500 people, the smallest town only having 82. I grew up in a predominantly white, farming, middle-class area, and I would think it's safe to say that less than 1% of my school wasn't Caucasian. Out of the 41 kids in my graduating class, one of them was a different race.
Hey, I'm Haley Zabel, and I grew up in Firth, Nebraska, which is about 20 minutes south of Lincoln. I went to a Class B high school comprised of 9 surrounding communities. The typical graduating class was about 150 students. My high school was referred to as the White Castle of the Lincoln area, meaning that we were a fairly wealthy school district with very few racial minorities. We're taught in schools that diversity is a range of different things, but when it comes to people, a lot of people understand it is a range of different races, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds. One of the first nights in class, Gia looked at us and challenged our idea of the context of this term.
When Gia asked us how our schools were diverse and told us to talk about it at our tables, my first reaction was that there was no diversity or little diversity in the school that I graduated from, because I graduated with a majority of white, middle-class kids. I didn't even think to look at how diverse the religious and social economic standings caused my school of 400 people to be just as diverse as some of the bigger schools.
I completely agree. We were known as the White Castle. Who would think there was any diversity in the White Castle? But we did have diversity. It just takes a little bit of outside-of-the-box thinking to realize it. Our school had very wealthy residents, and we had some not-so-wealthy residents. It caused for a very, very large economic gap between the two ends. For example, last year in our school's elementary backpack program, we were in need of 77 weekend meals. This means that 1 in every 6 children's families were struggling to have food for the weekend. And although we usually don't classify this as diversity, it is one and the same. And it's easy to see that how our home lives can be very, very different.
I think that once we teach our students that diversity, even when talking about people, is a range of different things. I'm not saying that we need to be colorblind, and I'm also not saying that we need to draw attention to the social economic differences of students. But if I were to go back and look at my class, I would no longer see all the white kids. I would see the farm kids and the town kids and the kids who lived in this area forever and the kids who just moved here. I'd see the kids who don't like sports and would rather read a comic book, and the kids who live for sports and also think that comic books are really cool. Most importantly, I would see that even though each of my classmates is completely different, we are a very diverse class. We all have one thing in common, and that is the same. We all have things to learn from each other.
Yeah, I totally agree. Coming from a bigger town than both of you guys, I think it's important to not only realize where people come from or what kind of household they might live in, but also how people identify themselves. Being in the same school with a lot of students, people have their different beliefs and what they think is right or wrong. There was quite a few people in my high school that were part of the LGBTQ community. Since we were combined with the school of about 400 people, there are individuals that did not believe in same-sex relationships, being transgender, and so on. I've seen people get bullied just because they identify themselves as gay, or people for saying they acted gay. We all agree that diversity is not just race, ethnicity, gender, or language, but it is much bigger than that. And by being in this class, it has taught us to become more aware of how students' social class, sexual orientation, and or learning abilities can affect diversity as well.
You're so right. How people identify themselves is usually completely forgotten when discussing diversity. And with the acceptance of the LGBTQ community, growing it's important is an important part of diversity that affects nearly everyone. I know at least 4 students in my school that have come out in the past year, and it's extremely exciting.
So like my school, I didn't have a lot of like LGBT kids because we were a very like small school, and even though like that movement is growing momentum, like in small rural conservative areas, like it's still not a big thing. But like, how did the kids coming out, or like, how did this movement gaining so much momentum? How did it affect your guys' schools? Like, how did it change the like student atmosphere and like different rules and stuff?
Right. So my school is very large, and since we have a lot of kids, like there's like just a wide variety of kids. There, got your farm kids, like kids of low income, middle class, higher class, just all over the place. And my freshman year, we didn't have any like discrimination law or rules, I guess, and like bullying was a really big thing, and for especially the LGBT community. And my junior year, we like had a pep assembly about bullying, and like we'd have to take one course over LGBTQ, and I feel like that just really helped and like let the LGBTQ community members really come out and just be more comfortable in their own skin and be more comfortable at school too.
Yeah, and with my school, we're not as big. In my high school, there's about 450 kids, and even though that is quite a few, my freshman year, we had a speaker come in and talk about the LGBTQ community, and that actually encouraged one of my friends to come out, which is super exciting. Like, we all kind of had a feeling, but he didn't want to come out and say it openly, just because he was afraid of what would backlash because of it. And nothing really happened. Our school is a very anti-bullying school, and we have a lot of assemblies on it, and we're very strict no hate zones. So I think that definitely helps. I know there's at least 3 of my teachers that have the little pink triangle in their room, which is cool. That's new recently in my last like semester of high school. I noticed it, so that's really cool.
I think it's really interesting how that has changed, like the LGBT like gaining momentum, how that changed your schools. Like with my school, like bullying has always kind of been a problem, and I think that's just a thing that happens in small schools because it's everything about everybody, literally everything. But like I've definitely noticed more and more that my school has been taking movements and like actions towards limiting bullying and bringing more awareness to the differences of students. Like, because in my school it was a lot of like the farm, like if a kid who didn't live on a farm was like joining FFA or something, like the farm kids would like. There's definitely a little bit of judgment and a little bit of hate there. Like you weren't raised like this. Like you don't know what an actual farm is. Like even though they come from a town of like 30 people, there's still a little bit of hate and stuff. And I think it's really interesting how the more we're becoming aware of just how different everybody is and just how much like judgment and how much bullying like actually does happen, and we're like bringing more of that into the school and discussing it and we're talking about it. And I think that's really important because nothing is going to change until it gets talked about. And I think it's really cool that your guys' schools were doing like assemblies and you guys were talking about it. Like your administrators were coming out and saying like, hey, this is a thing, so here it is, like why are you uncomfortable? And they're also, when you talk about it and you get the facts out there, there's less ignorance, and ignorance breeds hate. So I think that's really cool and important too.
Right. I agree that the more you educate people, the more they know, and the more, well, hopefully open-minded they'll be. And it just makes people comfortable. Like, especially beginning in high school, it's hard for people to like be comfortable in their own skin. And once someone tells you, it's okay, then you'll be comfortable.
Yeah, and when we're talking about bullying, it leads straight into diversity because generally bullying has to do because someone is different than you. And I think the more that we're educating on bullying and the more kids understand about why this is happening, the more they're going to understand about diversity in general, which is going to help our society as a whole.
I definitely agree. And I also think that the better that we teach our students about the different things, like the better that we teach them about different ethnicities, and the better we teach them about the different genders and about the different like sexual orientations and all of that stuff, the better they understand it. And I think a lot of it, like when you don't know about something, like I think it like scares you or it worries you, and I think the more that you learn about it, it takes away that scare, that fear and that worry. And I think that's really important too. And I think that definitely from all the education and all the like anti-bullying seminars, I think that's actually also doubles as a hey, like we're super diverse like seminar too. So I think that's really important. I think this myth has been destroyed. Diversity goes above and beyond just race, religion, and ethnicity, and everyone has something about them that makes them different from everybody else in the room, even if that room is super small and the people in it are very, very similar.
Today's generation, when they hear the term segregation, they think of the word that their parents and grandparents grew up with: no blacks allowed. Signs posted in storefronts in the schools with little to no funding for non-white students. And they sigh a breath of relief, thinking that they're lucky to have the good fortune to not have to grow up with segregation. Looking at the education system in some schools that are struggling to get by with the funding, a lower graduation rates, can say that this is completely true. Nowadays, segregation in schools is not necessarily based off the color of your skin, but by your learning abilities. I understand that some students might need more help than others, but segregating them into different classrooms by their learning achievements is not fair to them.
I think you could even go as far to say that there is a little bit of segregation in schools based on color. Not on purpose, but if you look at the inner city schools in cities like Houston or Chicago, you don't see a lot of white. Now, here are the schools that are officially segregating by money. These students live in poverty, but by limiting the funding that impoverished areas receive simply because they don't get high enough test scores, thank you, No Child Left Behind, you just create a vicious circle of students with parents who are uneducated because the only education system available to them is a joke. Compared to education to other students receive who raise kids who don't believe that education is important, because the education they're receiving is awful and light years behind what it should be in 2016.
That's a good point, and I'd have to agree that NCLB does fail to prove the right amount of funding to schools, how achievement is measured by a student's performance, and the failure to address reasons for lack of achievement, abilities, language deficits, class sizes, homelessness, hunger, lack of health care, and so on.
Both of your points are proven in This American Podcast. The problem we all live with. The podcast is about Normandy, Missouri School District and how the schools are trying to close the achievement gaps. It was noticed that the achievement gaps were never closed, and blacks and Latinos were still being left behind. The one thing that has been proven to close the achievement gaps is integration, busing kids from poorer communities to richer white suburbs. This seems like a very 1960s method. However, it's the only methods that is proved to actually help.
I think that's a really important thing to talk about, is that we're pulling in ways that we were using in the 1960s to help close this gap now. Like, if you want to say that there's not segregation in schools, that's fine, but you can't prove it, because I definitely know that the kids in my school, even in my own school, who came from lower income houses or whose parents weren't as disciplined or as hard on them as other parents were, they definitely got left behind, and they definitely did not succeed as well as other students did. And I mean, you can even go so far as to say, like, that's the student's fault. Like, it all depends on their motivation. But some of those students really, I believe, could have had a brighter future than what they probably are facing now, because our school just didn't put as much time and effort into them. And my graduating class was known as the bad class of the school. Like, our students were a lot of youngest child, and so we had a lot of like rebels and a lot of kids trying to prove that they were bad and they were awesome, you know. But like, the school just kind of gave up on them, and they definitely focused more on other classes. And I think that that's something that we do maybe a little bit by human nature, but I also think the school just kind of gave up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that in every school, and it's really, really sad to look at the statistics and see that there's so many different schools and so many different cities where there are schools that are being segregated based off of income. That's a really big majority. Like, we're looking at schools right now and we're like, yeah, everyone's allowed to go to different school districts. Like, doesn't matter anymore. But in all reality, we're not doing it on race anymore. It's been changed to an economic stimulus and changed to an economic manner that it's really hard to combat. It's really difficult. And I think that's something that we really need to look into and really need to study in order to fix, if we want to catch up with, like, say, China in the education standards or in the education rate.
I think also one thing is really important to look at when you're talking about this is how things are segregated outside of education. I mean, when you look at it, the poverty areas are predominantly African American, Mexican immigrants. Like, it's predominantly non white people. And I think you have to start fighting that problem before you can start fighting this problem. Because, I mean, even if you look at the Mississippi example or the Missouri example, I mean, it's not cheap and it's not economical, and it's probably a big pain in the rear to bus these kids to the better suburbs. So I think we need to, like, this would be a short term fix, but I think we need to look long term, and I think we need to start talking about how we can fix the segregation just in our cities, just in our communities.
Right. You think that, like, desegregating our schools, we've come a long way, but how far have we really have come, Like, we're still segregated in different ways other than race. So
it's a completely good point. Everyone thinks that we solved all the problems, but really we're just creating new ones.
Right.
And as Nito and Bode stated in the Affirming Diversity book, equal is not the same. Treating everyone in the same way will not necessarily lead to equality. Rather, it may end up prolonging the inequality that already exists. Learning to affirm differences rather than deny them is what a multicultural perspective is about. It has been attempted to do away with differences, an approach based on the notion that unity creates harmony, whereas diversity raises instability and conflict. Colorblindness is often met viewing everyone as the same, but equal is not the same. And I think that is something that people really often forget, is that you can't treat everybody the same because everybody is so different. Like, no one is the same. So this idea and this theory of treating everybody the same is very, very flawed.
I think we can clearly agree that the schools are still segregated and that this myth is destroyed.
So tonight on Myth Destroyers Teachers Edition, we talked about how everybody has their own little piece of diversity, and diversity doesn't just go by one name or one thing. It's many different things, and everybody has their own little piece of diversity in them, whether you like to admit it or not. And just because your school has 30 kids in every class, it's still really diverse.
And our second myth that we busted was about segregation and how segregation is still a problem that we are facing today in the school system. We might not see it as the black versus white, as the different race race segregation that we had in the 1960s, but it's definitely still there on an economic timeline and continuum. So we decided that myth is busted.
Well, kids, that's all for Myth Destroyers. Thanks for tuning in.